started as a Vancouver Island activist. 20 odd years ago out in Ucluelet, I had a group, Patriotic Canadians for Hemp, and as far as I know, it was the first kind of pro-cannabis, pro-hemp group going here in BC since the 80s when Normal was around. So it's always a pleasure to come back to my roots here in Vancouver Island and talk to people. And over the last 20 odd years, I've made a study of the role of cannabis in history, particularly religion, and looked at it in very many different religions, as Ted was talking, in the Judeo-Christian tradition with the Cannabis references, which are becoming more well known, in China, where it goes back thousands and thousands of years, in India, where it goes back thousands and thousands of years, in Africa, where it goes back 1,000 years or more, and throughout the world, and it's always interesting how these different cultures, these diverse places spread across continents in time, often come to the same conclusions about this plant and experience the same sort of qualities from it, and many times recognize it as a sacred gift that it is. And one of my favorite cultures to look at has been the Islamic culture, which is the role of cannabis in Islam. I'll start off with a poem from the great poet Hafiz, who lived from about 1350 to 1390. See thou this little berry, this green pill? It is made of dreams, yet so sustaining it, 30 fat birds all cooking on a spit would not thy bellies half so subtly fill. It is this berry the Sufis eat when they would fall into an ecstasy and tell their precious lives to you and me. A little hashish is a whole big cheat. 30 birds, say I? Yea, in one small grain, 100 times that number cook for thee. Eat thou, it will harm thee not, and thine shall be houris outnumbered ere thou wakest again. So it's talking about the classic Islamic heaven where you're surrounded by 100 dancing girls. The popular and widely used Arabic term hashish is itself a nickname believed to have been derived from a more general word meaning herb, and was applied to hemp resin products in the same way the generic grass came to refer to cannabis in the 20th century. Most likely, it may be simply the herb, as distinguished from all other medicinal herbs. Translations of other medieval Islamic names for cannabis products include the one that cheers, little morsel, shrub of emotion, shrub of understanding, peace of mind, girlfriend, the one that facilitates digestion, the pleasing one, visit of the green guitar, the one that connects the heart, provisions, branches of bliss, thought morsel, the one that lightens the load, medicine, holy Jerusalem, sugary, pill, the pretty one, medicinal powder, theriac, which means heal all, peacock's tail, consolation, the one that causes good appetite, the one that softens temperaments, the one that brings the party together, the little agent, amber scented, from Zion and emerald mine. This rich variety of epithets bears evidence the long and magical history of hemp products in the Arab world. And this widespread popularity is due to the fact that cannabis is not explicitly prohibited like alcohol in the Quran. Early Islamic commentators never failed to remark on the fact that hashish is not mentioned in the Quran or the old prophetic traditions, nor were they able to find any express reference to it in the name of the four legal schools. While there are a number of local differences, the use of cannabis with a varying intensity has had a time-honored role in the Muslim countries. This is in contrast to the use of alcohol, which from the religious point of view became the prime forbidden intoxicant. There are many reports that hashish was also used in medicinal preparations. It has been suggested that the interpretation of the Quranic law on intoxicants might have been more tolerant towards the use of drugs such as opium and hashish because of the paucity means of relieving pain in the medieval world. Dealing with pain in the ancient world was a major issue as it is today. As a result of this lack of clarity about the morality of its use, cannabis has been surrounded in controversy and thus a matter of debate in the Islamic societies since very early times, with devotees of the plant in some areas and periods enjoying the widest freedoms, and other times the severest of penalties for its use. In the herb, hashish versus medieval Muslim society, Franz Rosenthal discusses a number of medieval Islamic poems and stories regarding Islam and cannabis. Some accounts arguing that unlike alcohol, its use was condoned by Quranic law, but others, along with intoxicants, the other intoxicants, Muhammad condemned it. Once hashish consumption had become a widespread and debated custom, there was much more discussion among Muslim scholars and other interested parties about its history. The theories put forward ranged from the fanciful to the strong semblance of fact. The samples preserved in literature make us suspect that there was once much more which went unrecorded, and that the legal and political struggle over the drug was accompanied by arguments derived from history favoring one side or the other. As Rosenthal explained, it is even possible that some authorities who denounced the use of drugs in the strongest terms were secret addicts, or at least some actual drug experiences that informed their judgment. And there's a classic Sufi tale of a caliph condemning the use of hashish, and while he's giving this big lecture, his bag of hash falls out on the ground in front of everybody. He picks it up and puts it back in his pocket. And that's kind of true today of a lot of politicians and individuals who are drug warriors, secretly using the drugs, lawyers, judges, police, all sorts of people. At times of the strictest prohibition, the user was criminally culpable, but not condemned with death, as were those heretics who declared the use of hashish lawful and permissible. Such figures were to be refused funeral prayers and Muslim burials. When the government decided to proceed energetically against the use of drugs, severe penalties were demanded and apparently imposed. These included the death penalty. In the 13th century, Baybars prohibited the consumption of wine and hashish and invoked the sword as punishment. For it, in the latter part of the 14th century, Sudan ash-Shakanani punished people accused of making hashish with the extraction of their molars, and many suffered this fate. Despite these harsh attempts at prohibitions, by later medieval times, hashish use was surprisingly widespread. Fuzuli, who lived from 1483 to 1556, wrote that in the late medieval period, hashish can claim to be the friend of the dervishes and be available in the corner of every mosque and among all kinds of scholars. So this is like right back in the medieval times, like widespread. The medieval Islamic use of cannabis is generally concerned around two groups, the Hashishins and the Sufis, but it should also be noted that some sources believe that the use of cannabis in Islam started with the religious founder, Muhammad. Muhammad was a merchant from an early age and worked in the ancient trade routes between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. Undoubtedly, as a result of this, he would have come under much foreign influence and into contact with rare commodities traded by other travelers, which can be sure to have included cannabis products, as well as the myths and magics of the plant that surrounded its consumption. Muhammad's potential relationship with cannabis has been explored recently in Yoel Nathan's Moses and Monotheism. Nathan is amongst those who have seen the origins of the Islamic cannabis use with the Zoroastrian Hayoma tradition, and he claims that the Islamic sacred sites, such as the Kaaba in medieval times, was nothing more than a medieval hashish den. He also believes that Quran references to Muhammad rubbing devotees may be evidence that the Prophet was using the cannabis-based healing oils and ointments of the Hebrews and Christians. And these are back again to these cannabis references where topical preparations of cannabis and cannabis incenses were used in the Bible. As Nathan explains, Moses knew of the Zoroastrians, and they had the psychedelic Hayoma drink concocted with unknown ingredients. Allusions to the twigs and branches of Hayoma suggest perhaps hemp, and that's been the topic of my latest book. So was the Indian name of the Persian term Hayoma, which makes reference to a sacred beverage used throughout the ancient world. And there's been much debate about what the contents of this sacred beverage are. Popularly, it's been widely believed to be the Amanita muscaria, but as I show in my latest book, that's not the case. It's clearly a reference to the use of cannabis in the ancient world. And this use of cannabis continued throughout the Middle East up until even modern times. We know that up until the mid-19th century, certain Islamic groups were partaking of cannabis beverages under the name Hayoma. Unfortunately, there was little range of textual and archaeological evidence to help document this theory. Although it should be noted, certain Islamic, one of the most interesting things in this regard is the Indian text, the Dabistan, thought to have been composed in the 17th century, which records a fascinating account of Muhammad's alleged introduction to cannabis and its association with this hereditary plant, the Hashim. And so this is from the 17th century text, the Dagestan, and it's about Muhammad's introduction to hashish. So this was recorded, quite a period of time after Muhammad, but it goes back to much more older traditions. There is a class among the Hindus who give to themselves the terms the Musliman Sofis, the Muslim Sufis, and really agree in several tenets and opinions with the Sufis. They relate that one day the Prophet was taking a pleasure walk under the guidance of Jibril, the Muslim angel Gabriel, and came to a place where a great tumult was heard. Gabriel said, "This is the threshold of pleasure. Enter into the house." The Prophet consented to go in there, and he saw sitting 40 persons naked as they came from their mother, and a band busy serving whatever service the Prophet requested them to do. They did not comply until the moment to grind bhang arrived. Bhang is a Hindu preparation, a drink prepared from cannabis. When they had ground it, they had no cloth through which they could strain and purify it. You grind the cannabis with water and milk, and then you strain it through a cloth. Then the Prophet, having taken his turban from his hand, purified through it the juice of bhang, the color green of which the bhang remained on the turban, whence the garment heraldry, which became the color of the Muhammad sub-tribe, the Hashims, which is green. When the Prophet rendered them this service, they were glad and said among themselves, "Let us give to this messenger of God, who is always running to the door of the ignorant, a little of the bhang, that he may obtain the secrets of the Almighty power." So they gave the remains of the juice to the Prophet. When he had drunk it, he became possessed by the seeds of the angel of destiny, and whatever man heard from him came through the means of this bounty. So we can already see centuries ago that this was like playing a pivotal role amongst the Sufis. Edward Brown, writing in the 19th century, noted that in his time, one of the secret names of cannabis was Master Saeed, from a fancied resemblance between its green color and the green turbans worn by the reputed descendants of the Prophet. So this was clearly a lasting tradition. Although the Dagestan is clearly a later addition to the Muslim traditions, earlier accounts of cannabis use, such as that of the Assassins, Ismailis, and the Sufi groups, which goes back to about 1000 AD, gives clear indications that such practices were known very early in the Islamic world, and as the research in this volume has clearly showed, predated Islam by millennia. So it was already in use for thousands of years in the area, even before the time of Islam. Moreover, these heretical Islamic sects consider themselves part of an authentic tradition passed down by the Prophet through his descendants and their closest devotees, in much the same way heretical Christian Gnostic sects thought of themselves as the authentic Christians through their association with Mary and other apostolic figures. So these people, these Sufis and dervishes and different groups that were using cannabis, they believed that this was a tradition themselves carried down right from the time of the Prophet and the Prophet's closest relatives and followers. This is where the Hashishin come in, and their traditions were alleged to come from connections of Muhammad's own family. Some of you have likely heard of the myth of the Hashishins, or assassins, as they are popularly known. Many of you have heard probably the Assassins. This was a medieval group of hashish consumers, and the ancient myth is that the old man of the mountain, the leader, would pick devotees out from the Islamic culture, and he would tell them he was going to give them a special potion, and when they drank of it, they would die and go to heaven and experience the horrors of the afterlife, which were the dancing women I mentioned earlier. And as the myth goes, he would give them a real powerful preparation of cannabis, and they would pass out, and they'd wake up in this secret garden, and there'd be dancing girls, and they'd dose them again, and they'd wake up, and he'd say, "See, I showed you." And after that, they would be willing to do whatever he told them to do. Send them out on suicide missions and stuff. Now, this is, of course, the myth as recorded by other Islamic groups who considered the Assassins heretics and Christian crusaders. So it's probably a little less than true. It was probably used in initiation ceremonies in a similar way it is in India and other cultures. It's funny because Osama bin Laden's kind of a counterpart to these guys. Probably some of you heard that his compound that he was arrested at, there was cannabis plants discovered at that, so people are trying to tie in that whole tradition with this much more ancient tradition, although in the case of the Assassins, they usually targeted a single individual as opposed to thousands and tried to avoid wars. Just one second. The other medieval group associated with cannabis are the Sufis, and this tradition is believed to have been started by a Sheikh Haydar in the 10th century, a Persian figure. probably coming from a Zoroastrian background originally. And the story goes that Hagar sat in recluse in his home for a decade or more, wouldn't talk to anybody, wouldn't do anything. And then one day the Spirit came upon him and he wandered outside. And as he walked in the still desert air and in the heat, he saw one plant that seemed to be moving, even despite the stillness of the sun. And he went over and he touched it, and it was sticky, and he ate a bit of it. And then he returned back to his monastery laughing and giggling. And his followers were like, "Whoa, what happened to Hagar?" And then he eventually revealed the secret of the plant to them. And he said, in the secret of the leaves of this plant, your dense worries may disappear, and your exalted minds may become polished. And there's a poem written in the 12th century by Ibn el-Amana about the praise of hashish and dedicated to Hagar. Give up wine and drink from the wine of Hagar. Cannabis and products were often mixed with wine in the ancient world. Amber scented, green, the color of an emerald. It is presented to you by a Turkish gazelle, slender, swaying like a willow bow, delicate. In his hand and his beak as he turns it, it is like the traces of down on a rosy cheek. The slightest breeze makes it real, and it flutters towards the coolness of the continuing breeze. The grayish pigeons coo upon its branches in the morning, and the cadences of the warbling doves cause it emotion. It has many meanings of life which are unknown to wine. Therefore, do not listen with respect to the words of the old censor. It is virginal, not deflowered by rain, nor has it ever been squeezed by feet or hands. No Christian priest has ever played around with a cup containing it, nor have they ever communed from its cask to any heretic soul. Nothing has been said expressly for Melech to declare it unlawful, nor is the had penalty for its use prescribed. Thus take it with a sharp edge of steel, stay the hand of worry with keep, and achieve joyful repose. Do not lightly postpone the day of joy till tomorrow. The day will show you what you are ignorant of, and someone, for who you did not provide to serve you as a messenger, will bring you the good news. In his medieval dissertation on hashish, Al-Bardri referred to an elaborate hashish eating ritual attributed to Sheikh Haydar, which gives us some idea as to the piety and intent of the medieval mystics that were using the drug. And so this is from about, I believe, 1463 is when this is from. This goes way back. You must know that it behooves the intelligent, educated, virtuous, and sophisticated individuals who wishes to use this drug, which has the advantage over wine of being lawful, to cleanse his body of impurity and his garments of stains, and adorn himself with the acquisition of the virtues, and to discard the commission of the vices. He must ask for it someone who knows its secret and disapproves of keeping it concealed, and eat it in his place and not partake of it in the company of non-users. He must hold it in his right, not in his left hand, and say, the right hand is a clean hand, the left hand is used for taking care of business. In the name of God, the Lord of the last world, and the first who brought forth the pasturage, created and then formed, provided and gave, destined and guided, and taught the secrets and disclosed it, may God pray for Muhammad, the prophet of right guidance, and his companions, the leaders of piety. I know that you have deposited wisdom in your creatures and created usefulness in the things you have made. You have shown their specific properties to those with whom you are pleased, and revealed their secrets to those whom you have chosen. You have managed this plant with your wisdom, brought it forth with your power, and made it a nourishment for many of your creatures by your decision, volition, power, and will. Thus I am asking you, by your generosity that encompasses the elite and the common people, to let me succeed in using it in obedience to you and with avoidance of any disobedience to you, that you remove from me desires with their hindrances, the doubts with their consequences, and the trouble with their disturbances, that you let me see the existent things that really are, and that you provide with me the benefits and ward off from me its harmful results. You who has the power over everything and sees every situation. He then puts it in his mouth and grinds it with his molars, drinks something to go with it, moves his jaw and sends it down to his guts. Then he praises God for his kindness. He cleanses his mouth of its remnants, washes his face, and raises his voice in song. For the creator of beauty, for beauty provokes hashish intoxication and rest. He rubs antimony on his teeth so that coarser souls will not notice what is the matter with him, and he braids the hair of his beard in cheerfulness. Cheerfulness does not leave his mind, and he is restful in the way he walks and his commands and prohibitions. He uses the most delicate food and the noblest of sweet speech. He gazes at beautiful faces and sits in the most pleasant of places. He stays near where water is murmuring and keeps company with experienced friends. He turns to reflecting about the cause and the things caused, about the doer and the things done, about event and result, about speaker and things spoken, and about agent and sweetness, and the thing caused by action in this condition. Enough of the eternal knowledge of God and his universal grace emanates upon him to let him perceive the views and their meaning, to show him the things with their contents. He notices the heart with the eyes and controls the eyes with the heart. He separates from his idea of humanity and joins with the idea of divinity, the name of which the poor are known, becomes lawful for him in reality, and he reaches the degree of divine success. So that was al-Badri in 1463. In the Dervishes, or Oriental Spiritualism, John Porter offers some enlightening insights about the use of hashish in the Islamic world. This was written in 1868. The first intention of hashish was evidently not as a stimulant. It was intended as a spiritual soporific, producing the quiescence of soul so dear to Orientals, and known throughout all the regions under the Arabian influence by the name of Keef. But this stolid annihilation of ideas was not sufficient for the more exalted natures. These find a higher power in the drug, that of raising the imagination until it attained the beatified realization of the joys of the future world. Another 19th century scholar, Edward G. Brown, noted in a chapter from the history of cannabis indica that uses of hemp preparation in the area extended from Zoroastrian times to the 19th century, where its use was still deeply cloaked in the Ishmaelian mystical beliefs about the plant. This was written in 1897. Cannabis indica appears to have been known in Persia in very early times, as students of the ancient Zoroastrian scriptures assert. Allusion is made to it in the Avesta, and this goes back 3,000 years at least. At the present day, it is extensively used here as the inspirer of the wildest pantheistic speculation, the most disordered metaphysical fantasies, and the most incredible visions and ecstasies. It is generally known as hashish, an Arabic word meaning cut grass or dried herbs, or by its Persian name, balm. Besides these, there are some preparations known by special names, such as chars, barsh, and hub-i-nishat, or pills of delight, of which preparation the first is smoked, the last two eaten. At present, as I am informed of one of my Persian friends, the method most fashionable amongst the dervishes of Tehran is to employ the bug-i-wadat, or trumpet of unity. A small piece of paper or cardboard is rolled up into the shape of a funnel, of which the smaller end of the funnel is placed in the mouth. A piece of hashish is laid on the lighted end of a cigarette. It is then held under the large end of the funnel, and the smoke of the burning hemp is then inhaled. The effect of the drugs are produced much more rapidly than when it is smoked than when it is eaten. Subjectively, it produces an extraordinary dislocation of the ideas of time, space, and personality. It seems that all those present in the assembly are in reality animated by one spirit, and that the barricades of personality and individuality are, in some inexplicable way, broken down. It is this sensation or illusion which is specifically craved after by the dervishes, who find therein a foretaste of nirvana, or absorption into the universal spirit, which is the aim of their pantheistic mysticism to attain. And that this is the unity alluded to in the name of Bhagavad, of which I have spoken, the trumpet of unity. The sense of ego obliteration, or what one medieval hashish using poet saw as the removal of existence in existence, possible with cannabis preparations, as in the case of the Bhagavad, is in the description above was likened to a mortal death in medieval literature. This was also true of the use of hashish itself, which had to be sacrificed, eaten to have an effect. Puns on the term to kill were used in connection with the preparation and use of hashish. A play upon killing of hashish is apparently the case in a verse stating that the green one is a hashishah, that makes every man a hashish assassin unknown to himself. So by killing the hashish, you become a hashisheen. Later into the 19th century, cannabis and hashish products were generally associated with fakirs. And this is a print of an 18th century painting called Fakirs Preparing Bhang. And these figures were really important figures in the religious life of Islam. They were kind of like the tantrics in India, and they represented the more pantheistic, orgiastic aspects of Islam instead of the more dour, orthodox elements of Islam, which we're more familiar with today. And although these individuals were often beggars and had not even sometimes clothes to wear, many of them walking around naked, they were seen by the townspeople where they lived as important religious figures, people of wisdom that you could turn to for advice. And they were really hard to corrupt because they didn't want for anything. And although they were poor, people were giving them food all day. And so they would collect all this food all day, and then they'd have these great banquets at night. And many of the townspeople would come to these big parties where there's music and banquets, hashish eating, and great food. And this is a painting of fakirs preparing for such an event. Down in this corner here, we see a man stripping the cannabis off of the plant. Here, these guys are grinding the bhang, the cannabis, with milk and water and these preparations here, and mixing it all together. And then this is a sieve used for pressing out the leafy matter from the preparation and pouring it into a cup, which would then be drunk by the participants. Many of them have parrots in their hands, and parrots was actually used as a euphemism for hashish by these groups because of its speech-giving qualities. When the British and Europeans started coming more over into the Islamic world and stuff, the dervishes were really hard for them to deal with because they would literally disrespect them. They'd walk in front of their carriages, they wouldn't bow down to them, and this was really making it hard for them to control the Islamic people. And one of the ways that they decided to deal with this, because it was hard to deal with anything in the religious life of the locals, because it was a great offense and then it would cause, lots of hostility, was by trying to designate the use of hashish and cannabis amongst these individuals as causing them to be insane. And so they started building all these insane asylums and rounding up all the rabble-rousers. There's actually a book, Cannabis, Colonialism, and Insanity, or Madness, Cannabis, and Colonialism, that deals with this whole aspect going on in the 19th century. And it was really a big attempt to change the culture socially, and it's had a lasting effect in both India and the Islamic world, where where at one time these type of cannabis products were widely used and widely available, still are in some areas, but in a lot of other areas they're people suffer the death penalty and things like that for them. So it's been largely suppressed and backed down, although it hasn't been completely squashed, and there is still elements of this alive and well in Islamic culture. And in Afghanistan and stuff, you can still track down mystics and stuff who use cannabis as their predecessors have been doing for more than 1,000 years. So that's pretty much what I've got to say on cannabis in Islam. There's a lot more to it on that. I have a 60-page chapter on the subject in my book here, and if you want more details. Has anybody got any questions? You can open it up to a bunch of questions too if you're familiar with my work and you have any questions about any other things.
I'll see first, if you don't mind.
Yep.
I've read that the cultures over there, we're used to marijuana in terms of 1, 2, 3 grams. They're used to marijuana consumption in 100 grams. Is there a basis for that being true?
Well, in Afghanistan, they're smoking big bowls of hashish and big, huge water pipes, sometimes even earth pipes that are made, by digging a hole in the ground and putting a bowl and creating these big water pipes right in the ground. So they're using big, huge amounts of hashish. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, was just talking about in regards to Islam, involved ingesting hashish. And that's a lot more powerful than smoking it, you know what I mean? So they're probably eating a gram or two and having more mystical type experiences, almost psychedelic type experiences, as opposed to the kind of mild high we experience smoking it, which most people are seeking in the Western culture. In some cases, like amongst the Hashishin or the assassins, they were ingesting so much cannabis that it would literally knock them out for a couple of days. If you take a powerful cannabis extract, it can actually throw you into a death-like coma where your body stiffens up like a rigor mortis type state, and your heartbeat just drops down to nothing, and your breath fades to a whisper. And people have been actually perceived as dead while in such an intoxicated state.
Have you tried that yet?
No, I haven't.
I really want to.
Yeah, well, I'm all for you doing it.
Have you heard of anyone else
Andrew
try
Beale
it?
did it and wrote about it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How much did he eat?
I don't remember quite what he ate, but he said he was like stoned for a couple of days, and he thought he was 12 years old again. And went back to this time he had a fever when he was 12, and was convinced he was right back there. So I have this book called Sanctuary of Spiritualism. It was written in 1850, and it's 15 first-hand accounts of people eating 3 grams of hashish. And it actually led to the whole spiritualism movement of the 19th century, because people were reporting seeing dead relatives and things like that.
So have you tried?
No, I haven't ingested. I've ingested, potent preparations of cannabis, but not enough to actually knock me out.
Do you know anybody else who's really tried?
No, people aren't so keen to do that.
I think I might try for a 3
Yeah, well, you should film it and document the event.
Yeah,
I do know a friend had some trim left, and he made a big batch of brownies which had too much stick in. So he put that outside, and his dog, a big doe, ate the whole thing and kind of slept for 3 days.
Yeah, for sure. No, they've done it with dogs. They've done experiments with dogs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no lethal amount.
Yeah, there's no lethal amount. It can safely throw you into a death-like. It was used as for operations and stuff by the Chinese in the early 20th century.
There used to be an awful lot of hash from the Middle East and from India in the late 60s, 70s, and then all of a sudden it seemed to basically disappear. Lots of marijuana.
Yeah.
Very little hashish.
Well, probably a lot of that had to do with the situation in Nepal, where up until 1974 it was completely legal. There were hashish shops, and it was widely sold. And then the king of Nepal, under pressure from the Nixon presidency, outlawed it. It's been outlawed since, and that probably had a huge impact on the exported hash industry. Most of the hash we saw through the 80s and 90s was like a crappy black hash from Afghanistan that was stepped on. It was probably half shoe polish or something. Now it's hard to compete with the local hash. It's such good quality hash, thanks to people like Sita and pioneers like that.
Yeah.
I did have the opportunity of being a hashish judge at the Cannabis Cup one year, and there was probably 25 strains of import hash from all over the world, and it was you just never see that type of stuff. One day, hopefully, we can enjoy such pleasures.
I was just wondering if it was more legally, worked on, because in the 80s and that there was tons of it in Ireland, England, and all over. There's lots of hash, no marijuana.
Yeah. Well, there still is, like in England and stuff. There's still the soap, which is like the stepped-on black Afghani hash. Is still all around. Probably easier to score than herb.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But also just growing marijuana here. Once people started to figure out how to grow indoor pot and grow some quality indicas and stuff like that, it kind of killed the whole desire to import it and do the smuggling route.
I heard a little bit about the history of cannabis in Egypt, like in the ancient Egypt. I'd like to know a little bit more about it.
Well, you mean like pre-Islamic, like ancient Egypt?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a chapter on Egypt in my book. There's a lot of argument about whether the Egyptians were ingesting hashish or just using it mostly in topical preparations for medical use. There's a number of papyri that use it for medical applications, which are still used today, that refer to it. The Egyptian name is SMT, and it appears in a variety of medical papyri. But then there's other references to things like the Kaifi incense, which was incense used by the pharaohs and stuff, and perfume. And many people believe that it contained cannabis, although we have no surviving recipes, and this is based on what we do know about it. And then things like the nepenthe, a wine cannabis beverage, which was believed was mentioned in some Greek myths and stuff. And they've actually found old wine vessels in Egypt that have cannabis. When they scraped them and did the studies on, they found there was cannabis mixed with the wine. So they know there was cannabis-infused wines back then. And a few other kind of scrambled references, but most of the clear references are either in the context of cloth or else topical medical preparations.
One more about, I guess, religion, and you deal with religion as well as cannabis?
Yeah, my books all have been kind of about the role of cannabis in magic and religion, but that goes back in the ancient world, and it kind of covers all of it. Really, there wasn't any sort of like recreational use back then. Everything had a religious kind of magical connotation, along with medical use. These medical applications that we have from Mesopotamian texts, Egyptian texts, weren't just simple medical recipes, applied this to this. They were combined with prayers and magic and other things. It was mistranslated as calamus when the Hebrew texts were translated into the Greek around 300 BC, and this mistranslation followed into the King James. But there are actually references to cannabis, and when you take a look at these references in the context of the biblical storyline, and then compare it with the way they were using cannabis in Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylonia, places like that, in anointing oils, opens one ear to God, and the similarity of the names and whatnot, it seems pretty clear that these are references to cannabis.
Did the Hebrews use it?
Yeah, they used it in, the anointing oils and incenses that were strictly at first limited to the priesthood and the kings.
So Jesus was a Hebrew, then it is theory that Jesus...
Well, the term Christ is a Greek translation of the Hebrew term Messiah. It makes reference to this anointing oil that I was just mentioning. And in the first few centuries AD, there were varieties of Christian sects. One of these is rose to prominence. That would have been what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church, and that's where the modern Bible comes from. But that wasn't put together until about 325, 350 AD, somewhere in there. And there's all these other different texts which we've rediscovered in our own century called, under the name of the Gnostic texts, but actually a variety of Christian groups. And one of the main points of contention between these prohibited Christian groups and the surviving Christians, which were all based around Roman Catholicism, was anointing with this oil versus water baptisms. In the Gnostic texts themselves, they say there was fire in the anointing oil. Through the anointing oil, we're initiated into unfading bliss, but there's only water in the baptism. And they apply this anointing oil for a number of medical preparations. They refer to it as coming from the leaves of happiness and other things like that make it pretty clear it's a carryover from this more ancient Judaic anointing oil tradition.
And I'd also have to add that the hashish, or the incense referred to in the Bible as well, would have been mostly hashish mixed in with a couple of other nice smelling herbs. But
yeah, a lot of times they use the holy oil to burn the incense because the incenses themselves were so primitive that you couldn't just light them up and they'd start burning, so they put the oil on there and then burn the whole thing. Like the earliest example appears in Exodus 30:23. And God first appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of this cannabis mixed with myrrh and cinnamon into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he's the only one in the story that speaks to God, none of the other Jews in the story ever see or hear God, he goes into what is referred to as the tent of the meeting, which is a little enclosed structure. And he places some of this oil on the altar of incense, rubs some of it on his skin, it's fatty soluble THC. Go through your skin, and then he burns the incense, and he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the incense altar. And the pillar of smoke is actually referred to as the Shekinah, and represents the physical presence of God in the temple. So unless that pillar of smoke's pouring up over the incense altar in this tiny little room, the tent of the meeting, God's not in the temple. And the other Jews would know that Moses was speaking to God, and they look over the tent of the meeting, and smoke's pouring out of it. And so I think this is really powerful information in the sense that it kind of reveals the evolution of the Bible, you know what I mean? Moses becomes like a shaman who, like shamans in Africa or South America today, ingests a sacred plant, interprets the event as some sort of actual revelation, and then comes out to the tribe and says, this is what the Lord your God has said.
Sounds like the early form of hotboxing.
Yeah. Moses picked that one up off the Scythians who mastered that technique.